happens is that, and I'm jumping many years, 17 years, 20 years now, and in my book I explain what happened. There was lots of violence, and I go through all the different riots, etc. But for the purpose of brevity, the British government came up with the idea of partition and dividing Palestine into two states. And this is the statement from by William Ormsby Gore, who was then colonial secretary. He was speaking before the Permanent Mandates Commission, which was this body that would meet in Geneva every summer. Every mandatory power had to explain how it was administering the mandates, and so they had to go before this commission. And it's interesting because what Ormsby Gore is essentially saying is he's saying the Balfour Declaration, which he thought was always a compromise document, was not expressed in definite political terms, and it must actually disappear and be replaced. And in exchange, a Jewish state would be established with an Arab state and a special regime for the holy places. And this is a map of what was called the Peel Partition Plan. The area outlined in red was where they would have envisaged establishing a Jewish state. The rest of the territory would have been an Arab state, with Jerusalem and the holy places and a corridor to Jaffa. The Peel Partition envisaged population transfers between Arabs and Jews in this project, although Ormsby Gore in the same session ruled out forced population transfer. He spoke of only voluntary population transfers. In the interwar years, population exchanges were quite a common phenomenon. Populations were exchanged between Greece and Turkey, and later on in the Sudetenland. And so this idea was always there. But what's interesting is the British government considered it and always objected to it, which a lot of people haven't really noted. And I just want to make the point that when we hear President Bush or Tony Blair or others talk about the two-state solution, it's important to know that this is actually a very old idea. It's not something which emerged recently or since the Oslo peace process in the early 1990s, Oslo Accords. But it was, in fact, it was implicitly recognized in Article 22 of the League of Nations Covenant, and it was explicitly recognized by Britain in the Peel Partition Plan, which everyone forgets. Partition envisaged not only the creation of a Jewish state, but also the establishment of an Arab state, and also in its 1939 White Paper, which actually reversed the idea of partition and went back to a single unitary state. British policy at that time used to zigzag between support for what we would call a two-state solution and a one-state solution. They were never really sure which of the two to choose. They were never sure that partition would be viable, but at the same time they weren't sure that the Jews would be protected within a single unitary state. And then the rest of the world recognized the idea of having an Arab state in the UN Partition Plan of 1947, and I'm going to explain that in a few more details later. Now, it's usually pointed out that the Arab states opposed the 1947 UN Partition Plan, but it's not explained why they opposed it. I think the best person to sum up the opposition is one of the leaders of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, who, speaking before the UN General Assembly in 1973, raised the biblical story of King Solomon, where there was a dispute over the paternity of a child. And he said that the General Assembly, because the UN General Assembly had recommended the partition of Palestine in a very acrimonious vote. He said that the General Assembly, and he was explaining his view, the Arab National Movement's view, partitioned what it had no right to divide, an indivisible homeland. When they rejected that decision, their position corresponded to that of the natural mother who refused to permit King Solomon to cut her son in two, and the unnatural mother claimed the child for herself and agreed to its dismemberment. In short, what Arafat was saying and what the Arab High Committee was saying is they saw Palestine, they were the majority of the territory, and therefore they didn't see why they should have it carved up in any way for people who they viewed as immigrants, even though they had faced horrible conditions in Europe, especially after the Holocaust. But there were also other problems with the plan. It was also, from any objective point of view, unfair. It wasn't a balanced plan. And I think this comes out clearly by, funnily enough, a memorandum from Anthony Eden, who was a foreign secretary during the Second World War, when he was explaining, because the British government considered secret partition plans as well. And in 1945, they were debating the merits of another partition plan, which is not well known. But the same ideas, the same objections can be raised even more so as the UN partition plan. And in this top-secret memorandum to Winston Churchill, Eden said it would not be easy to persuade the Arab governments that it is equitable or consonant with the mandates, or with the Atlantic Charter, or with our own wartime publicity to include in the Jewish state all the best land, practically all the industries, the only good ports, and about a third of the Arab inhabitants. The reference to the mandate was important because of the principle of self-determination, as well as the Atlantic Charter, which was a precursor to the Charter of the United Nations, and which had a specific clause saying that no territorial changes would be agreed to that did not accord with the freely expressed wishes of the inhabitants of the territory. And this is a map. This is a map of what they were considering. This is the 1945 partition plan. The area outlined in green would have been a Jewish state. Notice that Jaffa in this plan would have been awarded to the Jewish state. It wasn't awarded to them in the 1947 partition plan, and there would have been a very large Jerusalem state incorporating Nazareth and Lydda. And the Negev would have remained under British military control, uniting the strategically important Sinai and what was then referred to as Transjordan. Now, when we look at that map and look at the green area, which is the Jewish state, and the yellow area, which is the Arab state, and when we compare it to the 1947 UN partition plan, you can see that the 1947 UN partition plan is much more generous to the Jewish state, which is outlined here in blue, and the Arab state is outlined in a kind of, orange-yellow colour. And approximately 55% of the land was going to be awarded to the envisaged Jewish state, according to the plan, bearing in mind that in 1947 Arabs were still the overwhelming majority, not overwhelming, but still the majority of the population, and also the overwhelming majority of landowners. In fact, the Zionist organization had not purchased more than 10-11% of the land of Palestine for various forms of purchase up until 1947. And so you can see why the Arabs, at least from their perspective, saw the plan as unfair. But there's an explanation as to why the UN partition plan was much more generous to the Jewish state than the Peel partition plan had been 10 years earlier. And the reason was the Holocaust. And it becomes very clear from the UN debates. There were tremendous debates about the merits of partition in 1947, and two plans were presented to the General Assembly. There was the majority plan supported by all the Western countries, and the minority plan supported by India and the Arab countries and Iran and a few other countries. And the minority plan said that we should keep Palestine intact, don't divide it, allow 100,000 Jews, survivors from the Holocaust, to enter Palestine, and there'll be strong safeguard clauses in that agreement. The majority plan, supported by the Western countries, said, no, that won't work. We'll divide Palestine into two, a Jewish state and an Arab state, with Jerusalem as a corpus separatum, as a separate body, was an economic union linking the Jewish and Arab states. Now, the Arabs opposed the idea because they were trying to link the creation of a Jewish state and encourage the survivors of the Holocaust to immigrate to Palestine. But we have to bear in mind that at the same time as the Western powers were doing this, they had maintained their immigration quotas on Jews throughout the Second World War and even afterwards, including the United Kingdom and also this country. And this issue was raised before the UN General Assembly in opposition to partition. And I'm going to read out to you an extract because I think it really captures the contradiction or the inherent in the idea. And I'm going to read out to you a statement by Sir Muhammad Zafrullah Khan, who was a British trained lawyer from what was then called British India. He then became the first foreign minister of Pakistan after the partition in 1947. A very eloquent lawyer. He argued in favour of the partition of the Punjab for the Muslim League in 1947, and then later on the British government brought him on the case to argue against the partition of Palestine. And later on, Khan would become a judge at the International Court of Justice and eventually its president during two celebrated decisions on Namibia and Western Sahara. And this is a statement that he read before the UN, or an extract of a statement that he read before the UN General Assembly when they were debating partition in November 1947. And he's being very sarcastic, when he raised the issue of why of the novelty or his opposition to the idea of encouraging European displaced persons to go to Palestine when all the great powers had maintained their immigration quotas. And it begins as follows. Sorry. He said, he told the UN General Assembly, "Shall they," referring to the displaced European Jews, "be repatriated to their own countries?" he asked. Australia says no. Canada says no. The United States says no. This was very encouraging from one point of view. Let these people, after their terrible experiences, even if they are willing to go back, not be asked to go back to their own countries. Shall they be distributed among the member states according to the capacity of the latter to receive them? Australia, an overpopulated small country with congested areas, says no, no, no. Canada, equally congested and overpopulated, says no. The United States, a great humanitarian country, a small area with small resources, says no. That is their contribution to the humanitarian principle. But they state, let them go into Palestine, where there are vast areas, a large economy, and no trouble. They can easily be taken in there. And when I was doing the research for this book, I was using various libraries. And at one point I was at Cambridge, and I was looking at, they have all the old files from the League of Nations. Some of them are very difficult to actually locate, and they're very old and fading. And I was just struck by this report. This is only a tiny extract from that report, because I couldn't fit it all in. And it's the last report on European displaced persons submitted by Sir Herbert Emerson to the League of Nations in 1946, before it was dissolved in September. And he made the point that a lot of surveys went into the concentration camps in Switzerland and in Germany and Poland, and the survivors were asked for where they would like to be repatriated, where would they like to go. And I've only managed to put on two of the surveys, one carried out by voluntary organisations in the United Kingdom, which said that 75% of the displaced Jewish persons wished to stay there in the UK, and only 25%, namely 12.5% for Palestine. And then they referred to a comprehensive survey carried out by the International Migration Service in Switzerland, showed a surprisingly low proportion of German and Austrian refugees who gave Palestine as their first choice. I'm not sure if surveys were carried out for Poland or Russia, and maybe they would have come out with different results, because obviously some Jews did desire to go to Palestine. But what I think this shows, and this is why I argued that neither Jews, in my first point, was that neither Jews nor Arabs are to blame for the conflict, and in fact that it was manufactured by the great powers, becomes very clear when we look at the immigration policies. There would have been no conflict if the British government hadn't said, no, you can't come to our country as the US, you have to go to Palestine, where they knew full well that there had been conflict going back from the very moment Britain issued its Balfour Declaration. So I essentially argued that Palestine was manufactured by outside actors. One question, at least a lot of scholars have argued, is the question of whether the creation of Israel was contrary to international law. I'm not going to go into too much legalities today, because it has a lot to do with whether conquest was contrary to international law prior to after 1945, and whether it applied to non-state actors who hadn't yet ratified the UN Charter because they weren't states. And there's a whole technical issue to deal with in the book. But I just want to read out to you an extract from the Peel Commission, which considered the possibility of a Jewish state being established. And they were essentially making the point that if the Arabs acquiesce or sign a treaty of cession, then there wouldn't be any issue. But if Palestine, if the use of force was used, if there was war or conquest, then the issue would be different. And they essentially said to foster Jewish, they were looking forward in time, and they said that to foster Jewish immigration in the hope that it might ultimately lead to the creation of a Jewish majority and the establishment of a Jewish state with the consent or at least the acquiescence of the Arabs was one thing. Although, as they already knew, and the reason why the Peel Commission was established was because there was an Arab revolt at that time in opposition to Zionism. We have to also remember that, as I said, that the Jews were never a majority in Palestine, even in 1948. And they went on to say it was quite another to contemplate, however remotely, the forcible conversion of Palestine into a Jewish state against the will of the Arabs, for that would clearly violate the spirit and intention of the mandate system. The mandate system speaking of self-determination and essentially majority rule.